Have you ever felt like no matter how much effort you put in, no matter how early you wake up or how late you go to bed, life still seems to move slower for you than for everyone else, as if you are running on a treadmill while others quietly pass you by, and maybe you've started to wonder whether something is wrong with you, whether you simply need to push harder, sacrifice more, endure more pain until one day it finally pays off, because if you've ever felt that quiet frustration of giving everything and receiving so little, then this story will change the way you understand work, success, and effort forever, because there was once a man who almost destroyed his life by believing that exhaustion was proof of progress, until a single realization forced him to question everything he thought he knew. In a quiet farming region where generations had survived by the strength of their backs and the discipline of routine, there lived a man named Daniel, a 34-year-old farmer who inherited a modest piece of land from his parents, and with it inherited a belief so deeply rooted that it shaped every hour of his life. The belief that hard work alone was the highest virtue and the only path to success, and from the moment Daniel took responsibility for the farm, he committed himself fully, without limits, without rest, without questioning whether effort itself could ever become a form of blindness. Every day Daniel woke up long before sunrise, when the sky was still dark and silent, and his body protested with stiffness and pain that never fully disappeared. Yet he ignored it, telling himself that discipline meant acting regardless of how you felt, and with his hands alone he planted, watered, repaired, lifted, carried, and maintained every corner of the land, refusing modern tools, refusing help, refusing anything that might make the work easier because ease, in his mind, was weakness, and weakness had no place in a life meant to be earned through struggle. From dawn until the last light faded, Daniel worked without pause, his hands rough and cracked, his shoulders permanently tense, his mind always racing ahead to the next task, the next problem, the next thing that demanded his attention, and by the time night came, he was too exhausted to eat properly, too tired to speak, too drained to be present with his wife, Emily, who watched him slowly disappear behind the mask of duty and fatigue. Emily tried to reach him gently, telling him that something wasn't right, that his body was failing and his spirit looked empty, but Daniel always answered the same way, that sacrifice was the price of building something meaningful, that rest could wait, that success would come if he simply endured long enough, and he truly believed it, even as his farm barely produced enough to survive and every season felt heavier than the last. Other farmers admired his discipline, yet quietly questioned the results because despite working longer hours than anyone else, Daniel's harvests were average, his profits thin, his stress unbearable, and across from his land lived another farmer named Lucas, a man of similar age with similar land who worked fewer hours, planned carefully, used systems, rested regularly, and somehow produced far more with far less visible effort. This contrast haunted Daniel, especially at night, when exhaustion made it impossible to ignore the question he feared most. How could someone who worked less achieve more? And then came a summer so unforgiving that the land cracked under the heat and water became scarce, forcing every farmer to adapt quickly. Yet Daniel responded the only way he knew how, by working harder than ever before. He woke earlier, slept less, carried water manually from distant sources, repeating to himself that effort never lies, that pain was temporary, that discipline would save him, until one afternoon under the relentless sun his vision blurred. His heart raced uncontrollably, and his body finally refused to obey, collapsing between the rows he had given everything to protect. Emily found him barely conscious, and at the hospital the truth was delivered without softness. His body was depleted, his system overloaded, and if he continued like this, it wouldn't be the drought that ended his work. It would be his health, and that night, lying still, Daniel felt something unfamiliar, not exhaustion, not anger, but doubt, the realization that perhaps the belief guiding his entire life had never been questioned because questioning it felt like betrayal. He whispered to Emily that he had done everything right, that he had worked harder than anyone, and she answered calmly that maybe effort alone had never been the missing piece, and days later, once Daniel could walk again, he did something pride had prevented him from doing for years. He walked across the road and knocked on Lucas's door. Lucas welcomed him and listened without judgment as Daniel finally asked how it was possible to work less and achieve more, and instead of answering immediately, Lucas led him to a shed and showed him two tools, one worn and dull, the other sharp and well cared for, explaining that endless effort with the wrong tool only leads to suffering, while strategic pauses create leverage. Lucas spoke about systems that replace unnecessary labor, about focus that multiplies results, about rest that protects clarity. And he looked Daniel in the eyes and said something that struck deeper than any criticism ever had, that Daniel was not failing because he lacked discipline, but because he believed discipline meant never stopping to think. That night Daniel returned home with a quiet sense of hope he hadn't felt in years, and instead of collapsing into exhaustion, he sat with Emily and planned, and the next morning he worked fewer hours but used the rest of the day to learn, research, ask questions, and build systems that reduced wasted effort, and slowly, almost uncomfortably at first, his routine changed. Within weeks, tasks that once consumed entire days took minutes, his focus narrowed, his decisions improved, his body recovered, and for the first time in years he shared meals, laughter, and presence with his family. And when the next harvest came, the results spoke clearly, not because he worked harder, but because every hour finally had direction. Daniel learned that suffering is not proof of progress, that exhaustion is not a strategy, and that success belongs not to those who bleed the most, but to those who learn how to think, plan, and rest wisely, because hard work matters, but hard work without strategy is simply a slow way to break yourself. And the moment you stop glorifying exhaustion is the moment real progress begins. Daniel didn't transform overnight, and that was perhaps the most important lesson of all, because real change didn't come from a dramatic moment of motivation, but from a quiet, uncomfortable process of unlearning beliefs that had defined his identity for decades. And every morning after that conversation he felt the pull of his old habits, the urge to wake before dawn just to prove something, the temptation to measure his worth by how exhausted he felt at the end of the day. Yet slowly he began to recognize that this urge wasn't discipline. It was fear that if he stopped pushing, everything would collapse, fear that without suffering he wouldn't deserve success. Instead of surrendering to that fear, Daniel began to observe his days differently, asking himself not how much effort he was putting in, but what that effort was actually producing. And for the first time he noticed how often he repeated the same tasks inefficiently, how many decisions he made while mentally foggy, how much time he spent reacting instead of planning, and this awareness alone started to change the way he moved through his work. He began setting clear boundaries for his time, not as an act of laziness, but as a form of respect for his energy, choosing specific hours for focused work and stepping away once those hours were complete, even when it felt uncomfortable, even when guilt whispered that he wasn't doing enough. And during those breaks he did something radical. He rested without apology. He walked, he breathed, he allowed his mind to slow down, and in that space ideas began to surface naturally. With clarity returning, Daniel started simplifying everything, eliminating tasks that added little value, automating what could be automated, delegating what didn't require his direct involvement. And the more he simplified, the more he realized how much of his previous effort had been wasted on maintaining complexity instead of building progress. And rather than feeling ashamed of this realization, he felt relieved, as if a heavy weight had finally been set down. His relationship with Emily changed as well, not because he suddenly had more free time, but because he had presence, because when he was home he was actually there, listening, engaging, laughing, and she noticed that the man sitting across from her at the table was no longer constantly somewhere else mentally, no longer measuring his value by the work he hadn't finished yet, but learning to exist without guilt. Months passed, and Daniel's farm became a reflection of his internal shift, more organized, more intentional, less chaotic, and when challenges appeared, as they always do, he no longer responded with panic and overwork, but with calm evaluation, asking what the situation required rather than what his ego demanded. And this alone prevented countless mistakes that once would have cost him weeks of recovery. Other farmers began to notice the change, not just in his results, but in his demeanor, in the way he carried himself, grounded instead of frantic, focused instead of overwhelmed, and some asked what had happened, what secret method he had discovered, and Daniel always answered the same way, that he had stopped worshiping exhaustion and started respecting strategy. He understood now that productivity was not about how much pain you could tolerate, but about how clearly you could think, that discipline without direction was just controlled chaos, and that the most dangerous lie he had ever believed was that rest had to be earned through suffering, because rest, he learned, was not a reward, it was a requirement. As another season turned, Daniel stood at the edge of his fields and felt something he had never associated with work before: quiet confidence. Not the kind that comes from forcing outcomes, but the kind that comes from alignment, from knowing that his actions were intentional, sustainable, and effective. And in that moment he realized that the true transformation had nothing to do with farming at all. This story was never really about land or crops or tools. It was about the countless people who believe that if they are tired enough, stressed enough, and drained enough, then success must be close, about those who confuse motion with progress and sacrifice with value, and about the invisible cost of that belief, the relationships neglected, the health eroded, the creativity lost. Daniel learned what many never do, that your capacity to think is your greatest asset, and when you exhaust it, no amount of effort can compensate, that working smarter is not about doing less, but about doing what matters with intention, and that the moment you stop measuring your worth by how much you suffer is the moment you finally give yourself permission to grow. Because you were never meant to grind yourself into nothingness to prove your value. You were meant to build, to create, to evolve, and the sharpest tool you will ever own is not your body, but your mind, and if you protect it, refine it, and give it space to function, it will carry you further than exhaustion ever could. And maybe the real question isn't whether you can work harder, but whether you are brave enough to stop and ask if there is a better way, because progress doesn't belong to the most exhausted, it belongs to the most aware, and once you see that difference, there is no going back. Daniel began to understand that the hardest part of his transformation was not installing systems or changing routines, but facing the quiet voice inside him that still equated rest with weakness, because even as his results improved, there were moments when old thoughts resurfaced, whispering that he was cheating the process, that real success was supposed to hurt more than this, and in those moments he had to consciously remind himself that pain was not a requirement. It was merely something he had been conditioned to expect. He started paying attention to the way his thoughts shaped his actions, noticing how often urgency had nothing to do with reality and everything to do with anxiety, and instead of reacting immediately to every problem, he began giving himself permission to pause, to observe, to think, and surprisingly, most issues resolved themselves or revealed simpler solutions when he approached them with a calm mind rather than a frantic one. This shift didn't make him slower, it made him precise, and precision, he learned, was far more powerful than speed without direction. Because when every action was intentional, there was less waste, less correction, and less emotional drain, and his days no longer ended in collapse but in a sense of completion, knowing that what truly mattered had been addressed. As his energy stabilized, Daniel began investing time in learning, not as an escape from work, but as a multiplier of it, reading about planning, systems, and decision-making, understanding that growth didn't always come from doing more, but from understanding better, and with each insight, he felt as though years of unnecessary struggle were being quietly rewritten. People around him noticed not only his improved results but his calm presence, the way he spoke without rush, the way he listened without distraction, and some interpreted this as confidence, others as maturity, but Daniel knew it was simply clarity, the absence of constant internal noise that once drove him to exhaustion. He also learned to say no, a skill that once felt selfish but now felt essential, realizing that every yes carried a hidden cost, and that protecting his focus was not about isolation but about integrity, because diluted attention produced diluted outcomes and clarity required boundaries. With time, Daniel understood that success built on sustainability feels different, quieter, less dramatic, but infinitely more stable, because it doesn't demand the sacrifice of your health, your relationships, or your sense of self. And standing in his fields, watching the land thrive without destroying him, he finally grasped the truth he had been running from his entire life. Hard work was never the enemy, but blind effort was, and when effort is guided by awareness, strategy, and rest, it becomes something entirely different, a force that builds instead of consumes, that strengthens instead of breaks, and that allows progress to compound rather than reset. And if there is one lesson Daniel would pass on, it is this: exhaustion is not a badge of honor, it is a warning sign, and the moment you stop glorifying burnout is the moment you reclaim control over your time, your energy, and your future, because the path forward was never about proving how much you could endure, but about learning how wisely you could move. So if you find yourself tired, frustrated, and stuck despite your effort, pause long enough to ask the question Daniel finally asked himself. Not how much more can I give, but what can I change? Because sometimes the breakthrough you're chasing isn't on the other side of more work, but on the other side of better thinking. And as Daniel stood at the edge of his land at the close of that season, watching the sun lower itself slowly behind the hills, he realized that the most important harvest he had gathered was invisible, because what had grown inside him could never be lost to drought, failure, or circumstance. It was understanding, the kind that rewires the way a person lives, works, and measures their own worth. He remembered the man he once was, waking in darkness driven by fear, measuring his value by exhaustion, mistaking survival for success, and for the first time he felt compassion for that version of himself, not shame, because he understood now that he had never been weak, only uninformed, taught to believe that suffering was the only language life respected. Daniel no longer chased the approval that comes from being the hardest worker in the room, because he had learned that applause doesn't build a future, clarity does, and instead of pushing his body to its limits, he protected his mind, knowing that every thoughtful decision created momentum that brute force never could. The farm continued to thrive, not because he sacrificed more, but because he sacrificed less of what truly mattered: his health, his relationships, his peace, and people who once pitied his exhaustion now quietly studied his results, wondering how such calm could produce such consistent growth. When younger farmers came to him for advice, expecting tactics or tools, Daniel spoke instead about awareness, about asking better questions, about designing days instead of surviving them, and he always ended with the same truth, that rest is not the absence of discipline, it is the foundation of it. At home, laughter returned. Meals were shared without clocks ticking in his head. Conversations deepened, and Emily watched the man she loved come back to himself. No longer a shadow consumed by duty, but a presence rooted in intention. And in that quiet completeness, Daniel understood something profound, that success doesn't arrive when you finally break yourself enough to deserve it. It arrives when you stop fighting yourself and start working with your mind instead of against it. This was the end of one story, the story of a man who believed exhaustion was the price of achievement, and the beginning of another, the story of a life built on clarity, strategy, and respect for one's own limits, because the true measure of success is not how much you endure, but how sustainably you grow. And if there is one thing this story leaves behind, it is this: you were never meant to be consumed by the very work you are trying to build. You were meant to shape it with intention, and the moment you sharpen your thinking, everything else begins to fall into place. And even after the story seems complete, Daniel's understanding continued to deepen, because transformation doesn't stop when results appear. It evolves as awareness matures, and as time passed, he noticed something subtle yet powerful. The world around him had not become easier. Challenges still arose. Uncertainty still existed. Seasons still changed. But his relationship with difficulty was no longer rooted in panic or self-punishment. It was grounded in perspective. When problems emerged, Daniel no longer asked why this was happening to him or how much more he would have to suffer to overcome it. Instead, he asked what the situation was trying to teach him and how he could respond without abandoning himself in the process. And this shift alone saved him from countless cycles of burnout that once felt inevitable. He understood now that effort is a tool, not an identity, and that when people fuse their worth to how much they grind, they become prisoners of their own discipline, trapped in a loop where rest feels like failure and exhaustion feels like virtue. And Daniel saw clearly how close he had come to losing everything by worshiping that lie. There were mornings when the old impulse returned, the urge to overdo, to prove, to push past the necessary point. But instead of obeying it, he observed it, recognizing it as fear dressed up as ambition, and choosing consciously to act from intention rather than compulsion. A choice that required more strength than any endless workday ever had. Over time, Daniel became known not as the man who worked the hardest, but as the man who always seemed steady, whose progress never spiked wildly nor collapsed. Suddenly, whose growth was quiet but relentless, built on consistency rather than self-destruction. And this reputation carried a deeper respect than exhaustion ever had. He realized that clarity compounds just like effort does, that each thoughtful decision made the next one easier, that protecting his energy allowed insight to surface, and that the most valuable hours of his day were often the ones spent thinking, planning, and resting, not the ones spent forcing action. And perhaps the most important realization of all was this: that life is not a test of how much pain you can tolerate before you are allowed peace. It is a process of learning how to move forward without betraying yourself. And the moment you stop seeing rest as something to earn and start seeing it as something to protect, your entire relationship with success changes. Daniel's story closes not with a dramatic victory, but with something far more meaningful: alignment, the quiet confidence of a man who knows that his work serves his life, not the other way around, and that true success is not loud, not exhausting, not desperate, but deliberate. Because in the end, the sharpest tool was never the system, the plan, or the strategy, it was awareness. And once Daniel sharpened that, everything else followed naturally, leaving behind a simple truth that remains long after the story ends. The goal was never to work yourself into the ground. The goal was to build a life that doesn't require you to disappear in order to succeed.